Problematizing is making sense of new information.
Oftentimes students and sometimes even teachers see academic thinking or believe academic thinking is actually the distribution and assimilation of information, where it's actually a process of inquiry, a process of problematizing, a process of questioning.
It emerged, it developed in the 80s and 90s as a way, in composition theory anyway, to get students to sort of have agency and ownership for the ideas that they were working on in their papers.
And you're saying, okay, how does this relate? How does that relate? In order to get a fuller picture, a fuller idea. And you're looking for those little inconsistencies. That's where problem comes in. How does it go against it? Does everybody look at it the same way? Does everybody agree with the same interpretations?
We might briefly discuss it, but I try not to openly present it or define it in class, because I find that the more I define it, the more limitations are being put on that concept. So I try as much as possible to have the students define it.
Problematization is a way to get students to see that they have to go more in depth in their reading and their research and their development of those kinds of things.
Really, to problematize is to invite your readers to think something through in a way that they haven't, to lead them into that questioning process.
The point of college writing is not to tell me what I already know. You know, a lot of times students think that, okay, I've given you a paper on this, I want you to tell me what the answer to this is. I already know what the answer to this is. I already know what the readings said. I assigned them, you know, so I'm not asking you to tell me what's already there. I'm asking you to read it, and in conversation with with me and with the rest of the people in the class, to tell me, what do you think this means? You know, how do you interpret this? How do you use this? How do you apply this to something?
The impact is critical, because instead of having students look at topics and looking for information, retrieving information in research or something like that, instead they're critically thinking about the context of a particular problem and then understanding what the problem is instead of just reporting information.
When you start thinking about all the things that you know that are related, and when you start making those connections, then you can own it. Norgard and Mezirow and Brophy and Frere, all people we've read talk about meaning making. That's where meaning making is a process of bringing dead knowledge, dead facts, dead data to life. Things don't have meaning until you make the meaning out of them.
I think we practice problematization because if we don't, then we will be following those same patterns of thinking or those same habitual ways of thinking and acting and those same points of view that lead to those very problematic issues where voices will be left unheard, images will be left unshown or invisible, perspectives will be left out of the picture. They'll just be overlooked because people would be content with some kind of status quo.
Problematizing changes the way we think. Problematizing also has a chance to change the discourse, the way something is thought about. So we want to try to impact on the limited ways in which things are understood, or the wrongful practices of things.
I'm willing to bet that, like most people, I don't have a day where I just say, no, we're going to talk about problematization. You know, I mean, that's sort of like the wrong way to do it. I think what most of us do, and what I do, is you weave these things into the semester.
Because people are individual and different processes of problematization might work for them better, it's hard to tell a whole class of people to do it the same way. So what I try to do is to try to give them a couple different ways they might want to do it.
We ask, first of all, questions about the problem, what the problem is exactly, who's involved, where is it involved, how, when does it occur, and most importantly, why is it a problem? Why is it occurring?
We try to look more at how others are problematizing, how Annie Dillard problematizes the act of seeing, or how Paulo Freire problematizes learning in the context of social relations or class struggle.
We use Ferrer a lot in our English 111 classes, and one of the reasons that we do is that he's deeply invested in the idea that you have to develop your own language for something. You're being asked to read things in ways that ask you to be interpret and ask you to respond, and sometimes ask you to disagree. Having students talk about a topic, talk about a reading, is one way for them to start to hear that there are other voices out there, there are other perspectives out there that they can draw from.
We usually choose learning problems that they have or that we're having as a class. If we're having a class discussion and some issues has come up that students are having difficulty with, we use the problematizing process with that problem together. And so we do that every day, daily, so that when they have their own problem to work with in their own papers or in future classes, they'll be able to do it on their own.
I want them to not be satisfied with the first thing they find. You know, learning is about going further. It's not about saying, oh, I found one source, you know, I'm gonna go back to playing video games, text my friends, you know, I'm good, you know, where's the beer? Learning is about saying, okay, I found one source, and it's a little bit different than what was talked about in class. Isn't that interesting? What else can I find here?